It's nighttime in the North Atlantic. A ship as long as 4 football fields is grinding through a storm, and every wave that slams into the hull hits like a sledgehammer. On deck, stacked 9 rows high, are thousands of steel boxes, shipping containers. Inside, TVs, shoes, kids' toys, car parts, food, chemicals. The ship tips one way, then the other, and each roll is a little worse than the last. Then there's a sound like metal tearing apart. One cable snaps, then another, then a third, and a whole column of containers, stacked as high as a 5-story building, starts falling into the ocean. One after another, dozens of them. In just a few minutes, hundreds of tons of cargo are gone, swallowed by the sea. So what actually happens to these containers? Where do they end up? Does anyone go looking for them? Do they ever get found? And if we're talking about steel boxes that weigh several tons each, how does something that big just disappear for years, even when people are actively searching for it? We'll get there. But first, let's back up and start from the beginning. If stories like this are your thing, go ahead and hit like on this video. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps us make more of these. Alright, let's get into it. Shipping is one of those systems almost nobody thinks about, even though it's basically the backbone of the entire global economy. Every single day, thousands of container ships are out there crossing the world's oceans. The biggest ones can carry more than 20,000 containers in one trip, and if you add up everything that moves by sea in a single year, you get a number that's honestly hard to wrap your head around. Somewhere between 250 and 280 million containers pass through the world's ports and oceans every year. At that scale, some losses are just unavoidable. According to the World Shipping Council, the group that tracks this stuff every year, about 660 containers went overboard in 2022. In 2023, that number dropped to a record low, just over 200. Then in 2025, it spiked hard. Nearly 1,500 containers sank or were left drifting, more than double what we saw the year before. A big chunk of that came from one disaster. In May 2025, a ship sank off the coast of India and took 640 containers down with it in a single event, almost half of all the losses for the entire year. That sounds scary, but do the math and the picture changes fast. 1,500 lost containers out of 280 million shipped works out to less than half of 1,000%. By that measure, shipping is technically one of the safest ways to move stuff on the planet. And yet, hiding behind that tiny percentage are thousands of tons of cargo, dozens of environmental disasters, and stories that drag on for decades. So why do containers actually go overboard? It's rarely just one thing. Usually a few problems stack up at once. The first and most obvious is the storm itself. Waves as tall as a multi-story building rock the ship, and if the lashings, cables, and twist locks holding everything down can't take it, the top rows of cargo just collapse into the sea. The second cause is way less obvious and, honestly, more dangerous. It's called parametric rolling. It's a resonance effect where the ship starts rocking way harder than the waves alone would explain. The ship basically gets locked into the ocean's own rhythm, and the tilt snowballs out of control before the crew even knows what's happening. The third cause is human error. Cargo weight calculated wrong, containers stacked badly, worn-out lashings that should have been swapped out but weren't. And the fourth cause, something people have only started talking about in the last few years, is warming oceans. Warmer water means more energetic storms, and more energetic storms mean bigger waves that can rip containers right off the deck. There's one more factor you don't hear about much outside the industry: sheer ship size. Over the last 20 years, container ships have grown to almost ridiculous proportions. What used to be a typical vessel carrying a few thousand containers is now a giant hauling more than 20,000 at once, with cargo stacked as high as a 10-story building. The taller the stack, the harder it sways in rough seas, and the more pressure that puts on the lashings holding down the bottom rows. Engineers will straight up tell you that today's ships have gotten so big that the old stability models don't always hold up anymore. Reality keeps throwing out surprises that the math on paper never saw coming. So what's actually inside these boxes? Pretty much everything you can think of: electronics, clothes, furniture, car parts, building materials, food, cosmetics. And sometimes hazardous stuff: chemicals, batteries, flammable materials. And here's where the real problem kicks in. Under current regulations, carriers only have to formally report a lost container if it's a direct danger to other ships, or if it's carrying something officially classified as harmful to the marine environment. A normal shipment of sneakers or plastic toys doesn't meet that bar. Technically, they don't even have to report it. That's exactly why independent researchers think the real number of containers lost at sea is probably a lot higher than what the official stats show. By the way, if you want to see how this hidden world of ocean shipping actually works, go ahead and subscribe. There are a few more twists in this story that are genuinely going to catch you off guard. Let's keep going. So, a container hits the water. What happens next? Here's the obvious question. Why do some containers sink almost instantly, while others drift on the surface for weeks or even months? The answer is physics, not luck. It comes down to a few things: the type of container, what's inside it, and how tight the welds are. A standard cargo container packed with something dense, like metal parts, can go under almost right away. Water seeps in through the gaps, and within minutes it's gone. But a container full of something light, styrofoam, empty packaging, boxed shoes, can stay floating for weeks, sometimes months. Refrigerated containers are a special case. Their walls are lined with foam insulation, and that foam acts basically like a life jacket. Some of these things drift for so long they end up crossing entire oceans before they finally sink or wash ashore. And this is where a danger most people never even think about comes in. A half-sunk container is basically an invisible trap for other ships. It's only sticking a few inches out of the water. Radar barely picks it up, and at night or in fog, it's essentially invisible. Hit one of these things, and a multi-ton steel box can punch straight through the hull of a yacht or a small fishing boat. Sailors call these semi-submerged containers silent killers, one of the most underrated dangers out on the open ocean, because they come out of nowhere and give you zero time to react. That's exactly why experienced offshore sailors, the ones doing solo round-the-world races through open water, will tell you a floating container is one of their worst nightmares, right up there with hitting a whale. You can't predict it, and at speeds of several dozen kilometers an hour, hitting a steel box can tear a hole open in seconds. Nobody actually knows how many boats get damaged by these collisions every year because so many cases just go unexplained. The crew hears a bang in the dark, finds a hole in the hull, and has no real way to prove what caused it. So who's actually on the hook for finding these things? Officially, it's the ship owner and their insurance company. They're required to organize a search and, if it's realistic and worth the cost, recover the cargo from the sea floor. Coast guards and local maritime authorities step in if the loss happens near shore or threatens shipping routes. In that case, the coastal country runs its own search and cleanup operation. Starting in 2026, new international rules will require every shipping company to report every single lost container. Before that, a huge share of these incidents never got officially recorded at all. And what happens to the owner of the cargo, the guy who just lost an entire shipment somewhere in the middle of the ocean overnight? That's where a whole other tangled story begins, one about money, insurance, and lawsuits. Under international shipping law, a carrier's liability to a cargo owner is, by default, pretty limited. The conventions that govern this stuff cap compensation for a lost container based on its weight or how many items were in the shipment. In practice, that means if cargo gets lost because of the carrier's mistake, the shipping company only has to pay a modest preset amount, often way less than what the goods inside were actually worth. That's exactly why serious shippers almost never rely on carrier liability alone. They insure their cargo separately, every time, as standard practice. This is where real insurance comes in. If the cargo's insured, and for international shipments it usually is, the insurer pays out the full value listed in the policy, no matter who's actually at fault, whether it's the crew, the weather, or a flaw in the ship. From there, it's the insurance company, not the cargo owner, that goes after the carrier trying to recover some of what they paid out, either in court or through a settlement. And if there's no insurance, then the loss falls entirely on the cargo owner. They can sue the carrier, but like we said, the best they can usually get back is a token amount, capped by international convention. For a small company, losing one big shipment with no insurance can mean serious financial trouble, sometimes even bankruptcy. There's another quirk of maritime law that catches almost everyone off guard the first time they hear it: general average. If, during a storm, a captain sacrifices part of the cargo to save the ship and everything else on board, deliberately throwing containers overboard that were about to capsize the vessel, the loss doesn't just land on the owner of that specific cargo. It gets split proportionally across everyone who had cargo on that voyage, based on how much their goods were worth. So technically, even someone whose container made it to port in perfect condition could end up getting billed for somebody else's loss. This idea that one person's loss gets shared across the whole voyage has been part of maritime law for hundreds of years, and it hasn't really changed. Lawsuits after incidents like these aren't the exception, they're the norm. Big disasters, like the one with the MSC Zoe, can drag on for years, with negotiations between the shipowner's insurers and dozens of cargo owners scattered around the world, each with their own claim, their own lawyers, and their own number for the damages. And figuring out who's actually to blame, the crew, the ship's design, or just an unavoidable storm, often turns into its own long investigation, because the answer decides who ends up paying. As for cleaning up the ocean and actually recovering the container, if the shipowner's liability is established, the cost of searching, salvaging, and cleaning up the coastline is usually covered by their insurer, typically something called a protection and indemnity club. That's basically what happened after the MSC Zoe disaster. The company publicly committed almost right away to covering the full cost of cleaning up the Dutch and German coastline. But if the shipping company goes bankrupt, disappears, or just can't be tracked down, and that does happen, the cleanup bill ends up falling on local authorities and ultimately on taxpayers in that coastal country. Do they ever actually pull containers off the seafloor? Yes, but not always, and this is where it gets interesting. The decision comes down to a handful of factors. If a container's sitting in shallow water and blocking shipping traffic, say in a busy channel, it's almost definitely getting pulled up, fast, because leaving it in the path of other ships risks causing a second disaster. If it's carrying hazardous materials that could leak, that's also a priority. But if a container went down in a few hundred or a few thousand meters of water and there's nothing toxic inside, the odds anyone bothers to retrieve it are basically zero. So who makes that call? It's rarely one person's decision. It's usually a joint call. The shipowner and their insurer run the numbers on the recovery operation and weigh that against what the cargo's insured for. Local maritime authorities look at how much of a threat the thing is to shipping and the environment right now. Only after weighing those two things, the cost and the actual risk, do they decide whether to bring it up or just leave it where it landed. Honestly, it comes down to economics. Recovering a single container from a few kilometers down can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions. You need a specialized ship, remote-operated deep-sea equipment, a full crew of operators, precision positioning, the works. And all of that just to bring back cargo that's often insured for way less than the operation itself costs. Put it this way, the container and everything inside it rarely tops a few tens of thousands of dollars in value, while a deep water recovery job starts around that same price and can balloon way past it. The math almost never works out in favor of bringing it back. That's exactly why most containers that fall overboard just stay wherever they landed, forever. Depth is really what decides everything here. In shallow water, 100 to 200 meters, you can still recover a container using fairly affordable methods, divers, basic lifting gear. But the deeper it goes, the cost and difficulty don't just go up, they explode.
At 1,000 meters, water pressure hits around 100 atmospheres, enough to crush a regular steel container like an empty soda can. Down on the deep ocean floor, where depths are measured in kilometers, your only option is underwater robots, working in visibility that's often just a few meters, sometimes just a few inches. Trying to find one truck-sized box down there is like trying to find one specific grain of sand on a football field, except it's pitch black and everything's under crushing pressure. So, what happens to cargo that sits down there for years or decades? That depends entirely on the material. The steel shell of a container slowly rusts away from the salt water. It takes decades, but eventually the metal falls apart completely and whatever's inside just spills out onto the ocean floor. Organic stuff like food breaks down pretty fast. Plastic barely breaks down at all.
Toys, packaging, synthetic clothing, they can sit down there for hundreds of years, slowly crumbling into microparticles and adding to that ocean plastic pollution problem you've probably heard about. And what about genuinely valuable cargo? Cars, electronics, high-end alcohol, if that's what's in a sunken container. Salt water isn't exactly a gentle preservative. Cars that end up submerged are basically always a total loss. Corrosion starts eating through the wiring and metal within hours, and even if you eventually pull the car back up, it's never going back on the road. Best case, it gets stripped for parts, or it becomes some kind of museum curiosity. Electronics like TVs and laptops go even faster, though sealed factory packaging can occasionally buy a device a few extra hours, tops. Alcohol, though, is a whole different story. Bottles sealed in glass can sit on the seafloor for decades and come out completely drinkable. That's exactly why champagne and whiskey pulled from century-old shipwrecks still show up at auctions, selling to collectors for way more than the bottle originally cost. But there's a surprising flip side to all of this. A sunken container actually turns into something like an artificial reef pretty quickly. Coral, mollusks, and algae start growing on the metal walls. Fish, crabs, octopuses move in. For marine life, an empty steel box becomes shelter, basically a home. Scientists studying sunken containers off the coast of California found that within just a few years, a small local ecosystem builds up around some of them, a lot like what happens around actual shipwrecks. But don't let that pretty picture fool you. There's a much darker side to it, too. Researchers looking at that same stretch of seafloor off California noticed that the sediment around a sunken container looks noticeably different from the seabed around it. As the metal rusts and the contents break down, the chemistry of the seafloor nearby shifts, and certain bottom-dwelling species disappear from the area completely. So the exact same object can be a shelter for some species and a source of local pollution for others at the same time. And if the container was carrying household chemicals, batteries, or plastic packaging, that stuff slowly leaches into the water over decades. Meanwhile, the plastic never really goes away. It just breaks into smaller and smaller pieces, becoming the microplastic that's now turning up in deep-sea fish living thousands of kilometers from the nearest shipping lane. Now let's get into the stories that actually made this topic famous. In January 1992, a container ship sailing from Hong Kong to the U.S. ran into a brutal storm in the North Pacific. Several columns of containers went overboard, and one of them burst open right there in the water. Inside were thousands of kids' bath toys, yellow ducks, blue turtles, red beavers, green frogs. The cargo scattered across the ocean, and it kicked off what might be the biggest accidental science experiment on ocean currents in history. The first toys washed up in Alaska about 10 months later, after drifting more than 3,000 kilometers. But their journey didn't stop there. Over the next several years, they kept showing up on coastlines all over the world, from Hawaii to Scotland, and some, according to oceanographers, even got frozen into Arctic ice and rotted clear across the pole. Scientists used all this to fine-tune existing ocean current models, a discovery nobody planned, but one that handed science data that would have otherwise taken years of expensive research expeditions to collect. A similar thing happened 2 years earlier, in 1990. Off the coast of Alaska, 5 containers fell overboard carrying about 80,000 sneakers from a well-known athletic brand. The shoes started washing up in droves along the Pacific coast of North America. Volunteers and curious beachcombers collected them, matching up pairs using the serial numbers stitched into the tongue. Out of tens of thousands of scattered shoes, they managed to reunite a few hundred pairs. And here's the interesting part. Right and left shoes behaved differently. Rights tended to wash up further north near the Canadian islands, while lefts drifted south toward Oregon. A tiny difference in the shape of the sole subtly changed how each shoe caught the current and the wind. And over thousands of kilometers, that tiny difference turned into a gap of hundreds of kilometers between where they were found. There are darker examples, too, of just how fast disaster can strike. In 2013, the container ship MOL Comfort literally snapped in half in the Indian Ocean and sank with almost its entire cargo, an event that forced the whole industry to rethink structural standards for the biggest ships out there. In 2014, a Maersk ship lost more than 500 containers in a single storm, one of the largest single losses in the industry's history at the time. And in January 2019, the MSC Zoe, one of the biggest container ships in the world, hit a violent storm in the North Sea and lost around 345 containers. Some of them washed up in the Dutch and German Wadden Islands, a protected area on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Toys, shoes, furniture, TVs, and packages of hazardous chemicals came pouring onto the beaches. 2 years after the disaster, according to local environmental groups, about a quarter of everything that was lost, hundreds of tons of debris, was still missing somewhere in the North Sea. And the most recent major disaster happened just last year. In May 2025, off the coast of India near the port of Kochi, a Liberian-flagged ship sank, taking around 640 containers down with it. A single event responsible for nearly half of every container lost worldwide that whole year. The ship was carrying hazardous and flammable materials, and some of it started washing up on beaches along India's southern coast within days of the sinking, forcing local authorities to shut down stretches of coastline and launch a massive cleanup operation. It was a stark reminder that one accident can wipe out years of statistical progress and double, even triple the industry's annual losses overnight. Does it ever happen that a lost container turns up completely by accident, 10 or 20 years later? Yes, and more often than you'd think. Bottom trawlers regularly snag old cargo in their nets that nobody was even looking for anymore. Sometimes it's a container lost decades ago and long written off the books. Oceanographic expeditions studying the seafloor for completely unrelated reasons, mapping whale migration routes, or exploring underwater canyons, periodically stumble on rusted-out containers buried in sediment and so thickly covered in barnacles and coral that from a distance they look like a rock. There's also a stranger, almost funny chapter to this story, the times when local residents just helped themselves to cargo that washed up on shore. The most famous case happened in England in 2007. The container ship MSC Napoli took serious hull damage in the English Channel during a violent storm, and the captain made the call to deliberately run it aground off the coast of Devon to avoid something a lot worse. Some of the containers cracked open right there on the beach, and once word got out, hundreds of locals showed up. In full view of the police, people started hauling off motorcycles, wine barrels, diapers, cosmetics, you name it. Officers eventually had to cordon off the whole beach, and the story's still told today as this bizarre example of what happens when the law and human curiosity collide on a beach. Every one of these stories is more than just a fun fact. It's a reminder of how big this problem actually is, mostly hidden from view. According to estimates from organizations that have tracked these incidents since the 1990s, the total number of containers lost at sea over the last 3 decades is above 16,000. And if you factor in the cases that never got reported, the real number's probably a lot higher. Some oceanographers put the true figure in the tens of thousands, all sitting right now somewhere on the ocean floor. Do maps of lost containers actually exist? Kind of. Environmental groups have been keeping their own databases since 2014, logging the coordinates, date, and details of every documented case, and today, those records hold more than 16,000 entries. But here's the catch. It's a map of where containers fell, not where they are now. The exact coordinates of where a specific container actually sits today are only known for a small fraction of cases. Currents and time take care of the rest. So for most points on that map, you're basically getting a rough starting point, not an actual address. Do real container graveyards exist? Huge piles of boxes concentrated in one spot on the ocean floor? In the literal sense, no. Nobody's ever found a place like that, and it's basically an internet myth. But there are regions where the density of sunken cargo is noticeably higher than average. Mostly busy shipping lanes with rough weather, the North Pacific, the waters off the Cape of Good Hope, where a lot of shipping traffic has shifted in recent years because of the conflict in the Red Sea, and the coastal waters of the North Sea. Those are the corridors where containers get lost most often, and it's there that the seafloor is slowly building up what you might call a scattered graveyard of modern civilization, rather than a concentrated one. Modern technology is starting to change the game here. Satellite tracking can now pinpoint almost the exact moment cargo goes overboard, and reconstruct where it fell using the ship's speed and heading data during the storm. Something that used to rely almost entirely on a watch officer's memory, which introduced a huge margin of error. Today, side-scan sonar can build a detailed map of the ocean floor and pick out the rectangular shape of a container among everything else down there. Unlike natural formations, a container gives off a distinct, geometrically clean sonar signature that an experienced operator can spot almost instantly. Autonomous underwater vehicles, which run pre-programmed routes without needing constant human control, can survey tens of square kilometers of seafloor in a single dive, saving weeks of work compared to old-school diving expeditions. And when finding it isn't enough, when it needs to be positively identified, remotely operated robots with cameras and mechanical arms take over. Those were exactly the tools used to confirm the origin and contents of containers recovered off the Dutch coast after the MSC Zoe disaster. There's actually a whole field devoted to predicting drift patterns. Oceanographers rely on mathematical current models that keep getting refined, and one of the biggest sources of real-world data for those models is that same rubber duck spill from 1992.
Thousands of documented sightings, tracked over decades as ducks and turtles kept turning up on beaches, became an invaluable data set on how water actually moves through the North Pacific, as opposed to how the models predicted it would. Scientists still reference that spill today, not as some quirky anecdote, but as one of the biggest real-world experiments in ocean current research that nature ever ran on its own. And now we can circle back to the question we started with. A container weighs several tons. It's not exactly a needle in a haystack. You'd think finding something that massive would be easy. But the ocean isn't a fixed, static space. It's a living, constantly moving system. Currents can carry a half-sunk container hundreds of kilometers from where it fell in just a few weeks. Once it's on the bottom, silt and sand can bury it surprisingly fast, especially in areas with strong bottom currents where sediment builds up quickly. A depth of several kilometers means total darkness, crushing pressure, and terrain that, to this day, is less mapped than the surface of Mars. And on top of all that, precise coordinates for where cargo actually fell often just don't exist. Storm, panic on deck, middle of the night, zero visibility. So even if you know the general search area down to a few dozen square kilometers, actually finding one box on the seafloor can be next to impossible. Not because it's small, because the ocean is enormous, dark, and never stops changing. Every year, global trade moves 250 million containers across the world's oceans, and the overwhelming majority get exactly where they're supposed to go. The industry's going to keep calling that a success story, and technically it is. 1,500 lost containers against millions of voyages really is a tiny, tiny number. But trailing behind that success story is an invisible wake that never makes it into any annual report. Thousands of steel boxes scattered across the floor of every sea and ocean on Earth. Some will only last a few years before rust eats straight through them. Others will sit there for centuries, slowly growing coral, becoming home to fish that will never know their shelter once carried someone's sneakers, someone's kids' toys, someone's appliances. And some will just stay an unidentified point on the seafloor forever, with basically no chance of ever being found, simply because the ocean is too big, too dark, and too indifferent to whatever's happening down at the bottom of it. Most people never stop to think that somewhere down there, under all that water, are the scattered pieces of everyday life from all over the planet, cargo that never made it to where it was going, and almost certainly never will.
Next time you're buying a new pair of sneakers or unboxing something ordered from the other side of the world, think about this. Right now, somewhere out there, a ship is pushing through rough seas, loaded with boxes just like it. And there's a small but very real chance that part of that cargo never makes it to the store and instead spends the next 100 years on the sea floor, somewhere nobody's ever going to find it. If this video helped you see the ocean a little differently, share it with someone who's into stories like this, and let us know in the comments, how many containers do you think are down there right now, in a spot no one's ever going to find?